Why could there be a deficit? At AS level, that essentially is what you need to know. Obviously, the trade balance also leads to aggregate demands, the components. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you about 8 or 9 minutes until 12 o'clock for you to come up with a reason, maybe a little bit less, a reason of why a surplus could exist, but also a reason why a deficit could exist. Ideally, 2 different points, and I just want you to explain them. Now, this revision session, I'm going to leave it up to you how you actually conduct it. So whether you know, some students tend to write a point and do arrows. It's a sort of time-saving way of doing chain of reasoning. You might want to write sentences out. You might just want to write points and describe and discuss the actual chain of reasoning. That's completely up to you. What I would recommend is when you're home, you go through the list and do chains of reasoning for everything. We're going to try doing as much of that as we can. So I'll go through the first one with you, okay? So balance of payment, obviously, and the current account shows a transaction between us and the rest of the world. What you need to be familiar with if there's a deficit or a surplus, and you're already very comfortable with that because we've discussed it a lot. Deficit would mean we're importing, bringing things in a lot more than we're exporting, and surplus is the opposite. What you need to be able to do is tell me why that might occur. Can someone tell me one factor that could affect the balance of payment? That could affect current account, lead to a deficit or a trade? Exchange rate. That's probably the most important one. If the pound, for example, is very, very weak all of a sudden, after Brexit, the vote, pound value can't drop. That means people from abroad can buy our products. They can afford it. It's relatively cheaper for them. So we end up exporting more, and we can't afford as much from abroad. We import less. That improves the balance, the current account of the balance of payment. It's important to use current account. That's it. That's one factor. What would another one be? Most people go with the exchange rate first. What would a second factor be? Right?
Inflation.
Inflation, yeah, inflation could be a good one. If inflation rates are too high, remember inflation is the average price, we'll go through inflation as well. Inflation is average prices. If average prices are too high, then people are obviously going to be discouraged from buying our goods and services. So exports are going to be lower. But on top of that, we're not going to want to buy from here. We're going to think prices here are too high, we're going to start importing. So again, it's leading to a deficit and damaging the trade account, the current account of the balance of payment. So balance of payment, essentially that's what it is you need to know. In terms of revision, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes for you to actually write some responses. Get into the habit of writing chain reasoning. So one factor that affects the balance of payment or trade account, current account is this is because this is that. So I'll just give you 5 minutes. Whenever I say you've got 5 minutes, you've got 10 minutes, you use that as you like. I showed you this yesterday. This is what I would be doing for all of these topics, right? I just be writing balance of payment, economic health. For a lot of these topics, you've got this one, you've even got the one that's specific for the UK. So it tells you possible reasons. It tells you why the UK has a deficit. For your exam, you need to know why there's a deficit or why there's a surplus, depending on the country. There's also, just bear in mind, with economic health, there's some things you don't need because this is for the full A level. So you don't need to know about all of this financial account, that's here 13. So you need to look through, you should know what the factors affecting the balance of payment. There we go. Here are 4 factors. For your exam, you always need to know about 2, 3 are the absolute most. Okay? So you've got 5 minutes just to work around balance of payments and then move on to the next topic. In that 5 minutes, you either write chain of reasoning, arrows, revision from this, ask me whatever it is you need on this topic, and then we'll move on to the next one. And that's going to be us covering key content. One thing to really bear in mind is just because there's a revision list doesn't mean that's all you revise. That's our starting point. Once you're confident with all the topics in the revision list, you go through spec questions, you go through the spec. You need to understand macro in general. Standards of living is not on that list. Unemployment is not on that list. GDP is not on that list. You will be writing about all of those things with your chain of reasoning. So we'll do the list first. In your own time, you go through the spec. Just make sure you're confident with key terms. That's part of our chain of reasoning. Okay? So 5 minutes before moving on to our second topic of index numbers, which I'll go through because we did it quickly. We've done it during lockdown with inflation. What it is, factors that affect surplus, deficit, so it could be a 2 marker, it could be a 3 marker, it could be a 6 marker. Let's say explain 2 factors, or explain one reason why there's a surplus, one factor that affects the balance of it. So it could be any of those things. Either way, you should be able to write some sentences on factors. I think personally the micro bit is harder.
No. So then you just come
This is because the change of it, you say the same thing all the time. Always think about aggregate demand, always think about GDP, always think about unemployment. It's the same thing for.
But say, well, we did micro in school. We actually got that.
That's true, but you know the key concepts in here, we've done it in class, policies, essay, we've done that in class. All the aggregate demand stuff is going to come up a couple of times. We've done all of that in class. When you go through that list, right, there's only a handful of things that would come up in a big way that you might have done at home. But more often than not, the questions aren't that difficult. Not to say the micro is, I think the micro, it's not that the micro is hard, it's that this one is probably easier. If you had done the macro in school, you would definitely find this paper very quite easy. So guys, what we're trying to do during this double session is essentially what we would have done if you weren't in lockdown. So you've seen what we did with supply side policy, right? We did a lot of that. You've seen what we've done with aggregate demands. That's why you're so confident on that, because we did it in class. I'm going to do the same thing, what I would have done in school had we been doing those topics.
This is going to be the 20 mark.
Yeah, 3 more minutes. Like I said, you use this time as effectively as you can.
Yeah.
I'm not going to direct you because everyone goes differently. Yeah?
What's the benefit of consumer spending income?
What's the benefit of it?
Yeah.
Well,
That's what you're supposed to do.
that's more linked to standard of living. So, for example, if we can afford things from abroad, that's good for our standard of living.
Either they're going to give us
If we can buy more things,
it's going to be
essentially
very
that's what
low.
that means. That's good for our living standards. That's the only
Yeah,
route.
it does. Because anyone can.
Yeah, and also, if you can buy things
Because
from
if I
abroad,
normally
it's
did
more
the
choice.
exam and I
If
got
I currently
60%, I would get I would get a C. But if I got the grade I was low, I'd get a B. Do you know what I mean? It's like I got a whole extra grade.
else in the country has that too, so it doesn't benefit.
Sharp.
Other way around. Deficit is a bad thing. Exports is a good thing, isn't it? Because selling will make
Wait,
you lots
it's
of
gonna
money.
work.
Yeah? Okay, there will be a few, this PowerPoint is up online, okay, or it's just a list of topics. There will be a few things I'm not going to go through today
I know.
because we don't need to. Supply side, probably not going to go through that. ADAS, probably not going to go through that.
I think we're
because
just
we
going
go through it every lesson.
Literally. I don't even know what to write.
Just think that like, if you just revise, you can actually do it.
That is true.
In maths it's hard, even if you revise, you still like, the questions are so hard. When you get the, are you going to get your results back for that?
I might try to short with some of those topics, but because of the limited time that we have, I'm sort of giving you, now you know exactly what you need to do. So if you want at home, you can do further chain of reasoning. Here in class, I'm going through the main point and giving you detail on the chain of reasoning. Some of you will have the time to start some of it, some of you will complete it in the time I give you. But because there's a lot of topics to cover, I will be moving on relatively quickly on some topic areas and spend some more time in others. Things that are difficult, obviously, we'll spend some more time. Yeah?
Just so what's balance of payments, do we just need to know the factors effectively?
Yeah, that's all it is. The factors that affect the balance of payment, the reason why there's a deficit, the reason why there's a surplus. And guys, when I say this is what it is, it's not just this is what you're talking about. Remember, it's still year 12. The bigger picture is sitting in A-level and doing well in your A-level exam. So when I say this is what you need to know, it's for your specification. You need to be, that's it for balance of payment. You need to tell me what it is. You need to be, for AS anyway, you need to be able to tell me what causes a surplus. That's the key thing for balance of payment. Now, the next thing will be something that you're relatively, you're willing to do with, so I'm going to go through it. I think it's for the first time, okay? Now, index numbers are extremely straightforward. It's easier than percentages. It's just something new, that's why it seems so complicated. It sounds confusing, okay? Inflation, consumer price index, and what index numbers essentially are is the comparison of data over time using a base year. So for index number, all you need to know is what it is and how to calculate it. There's nothing more you can do with index numbers for AS. So the definition of them, you can find it online. There's lots of ways of finding it. But essentially, it's a comparison of data over time or between years using something called the base year. So we have 1 year that we make all our comparisons against. Comparison of data over time using a base year. Now what a base year is that it's a year that we compare everything to. And what I'm going to do is a very brief calculation. I'm going to show you how you calculate the index number. Okay, so let's say we've got the number of cars sold in a certain number of years. Okay, so in 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. So in this 4-year period, lots of cars are sold. So in 2012, maybe 45,980 was sold. 2013, maybe 53,620 was sold. 2014 maybe went down, 51,200. And in 2015 maybe it was 65,000. So rather than what the index number allows us to do is to make comparisons using 1 year. So in an exam, the examiner or the exam paper will tell you what the base year is. It's usually the first year. So they will say this number is your base year, and we call that 100. That's our starting point. That's the base year. And essentially, what an index number does, it gives you a comparison of 1 year compared to 2012. So I can compare 2013 to 2012. We can compare 2015 to 2012. How do you think? So if that's the base year, that's the figure for the base year. Right? That's how many cars were sold in our base year. If I wanted to work out the value of 2013, the index number, so the 2013 figure, in comparison to the 2012 figure, how do you think I might do that? And it's a very straightforward calculation. Those of you who do maths or good at mathematics will figure it out. How might you do that? So I want to know what the 2013 figure is in comparison to the 2012 figure. Any ideas? No, Darren?
Do you take it away the times of 100?
No, you don't take it away. That's it. All you do is you get the 53,620 divided by 45,980 and 100. And that figure should be 100 and something, okay? What is it? 118, 17, 16, something like that? So what is that? It's the one you're calculating divided by the original. So you can essentially do new over original. Yeah? So guys, what that's going to show us is what's happening. We're making a comparison. Now, you could get asked, what's the index? Again, this is important so you know how you get asked. Calculate the index in 2013, calculate the index for 2015. If it's 2013, which I've just done here, you do 53,000 divided by 45,000 times 100. Someone do the calculator, 116, 117, 800. You figure that out. There's a difference between the proportion of it.
He's doing it. Oh, no one's bothered. That's right.
So again, 116.6, that's the index number. There's no units, that's it. There's no index.
How would you calculate?
That's literally what it is, the index number.
Oh, I didn't always put it in your bag, yeah.
Yeah, because index number is a calculation. It's like calculating
I'm gonna buy
costs.
spare
It's like
batteries.
percentages. There's no other way that could come up in your, even in your A-level exam, really. All you need to know about index is what it is. So it compares using a base year. There's no base year, 2012. That's 100. You can work the same thing out for 2014 and 2015. And there's the index number for 2013. If it doesn't ask you to round, you round to whatever suitable, 1 decimal place, 2 decimal place, fine. Even the nearest whole number is usually fine. Okay, so that's the index number. Does anyone have any questions on that? Always a small topic area, but it's good to understand index numbers because they give you lots of data, graphs. It might be index numbers. So you can see there's been an increase. Now, this is where it gets difficult. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this one.
So
Yes?
you just define by saying index numbers are completely easier to compare numbers over a period of time.
Using the base here. That is, so if you're defining it, it's important that you write base here.
This
That's
is the one I don't understand.
Otherwise,
In long-term trend rate.
Yeah,
I don't know what does that mean.
So it's well, so listen now, we're going to move on to arguably the most difficult question in the paper and the difficult topic area. One of the most difficult topic areas is macroeconomics. There's a reason it is difficult, okay? It's because most students across the country, so when this comes up in exams in previous years, a lot of students misinterpreted, they don't know how to answer it. These questions tend to be answered very poorly. And that's not me just saying that, that's according to Ed itself. It doesn't get answered well. The reason it doesn't get answered well is because people get confused about what it is. So changes in long-term trend rate. The long-term trend rate is the average economic growth, okay, over a specific period of time, and we make a prediction about the future. That's essentially what the trend rate shows. What you need to be familiar with is if the government was to forecast a very, very high trend rate, I'm going to show you a diagram to help you understand it. If the government was to forecast a high trend rate, why would they do that? Why might they predict a low trend rate? That's the sort of key for this topic area. Just like before, what we can do is just write long-term trend rate economic health, probably the first one there it is. The long-run trend rate is, so I've just written long-run trend rate into Google and write economic health, okay? What this graph shows, like I said, this is the hardest part of it, so we'll spend a bit of time on this, because the topics afterwards are relatively straightforward. Now, what this diagram shows is this is our actual economy. Sometimes we're doing well, like GDP is going up, sometimes it reduces, it goes up. That's just a business, that's just a cycle, known as a trade cycle, economic cycle, business cycle. That's how the economy works over time. What the trend rate shows is on average, how are we doing? And you can see it's improving relatively high. For your specification, for your AS and A-level and in what, you need to be able to explain why the trend rate might be very high or might be very low. So if I said, analyze why the government have predicted or forecasted a very, very high trend rate, that means this trend rate is essentially GDP. Why might the government expect we're going to have high GDP in the next 5 years? Or if the government forecasted a low trend rate down here, why might the government predict a very, very low level of GDP? So I think the key to understanding trend rate is that it's GDP. If you can think of a reason why GDP might be high in the future, that's you answering trend rate. You just have to throw in the language of trend rate. Okay? This is what students get confused with. They see trend rate and they think, what on earth is this? I've never heard of this before. It falls under output gap when you did the output gap. Business cycle, trade cycle, we've done it a few times. But essentially, it's economic growth. As soon as you bring something back to economic growth and GDP, talk about AD again, all the components of AD, aggregate supply, long run, short run. Okay. So on this page, if you scroll down, it actually shows you the factors that influence the trend rate. Now, all of these factors can be linked to GDP in some way. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of what you can say. So one reason the government has predicted a very high trend rate is because of, I'm going to pick one, a random availability of resources. Okay, if firms have discovered new resources, the potential increases. They can produce more goods and services. As a result, our capacity increases, our aggregate supply increases, our GDP increases. Hence, the government predicts a high trend rate because they think the trend, the average GDP is going to be really high in the next few years. Obviously, you could evaluate it and say, well, that depends on if they use the raw materials properly, or how many raw materials have we found, how much of it. If it's not much, then actually the trend rate might be lower. So that's what you need to be familiar with the trend rate. Now, this was actually a part of the business cycle lesson when you did output gaps and things like that. If I taught that lesson in class, we would be doing more of this. Obviously, because of lockdown, we couldn't, that's why we're doing it now. Okay. So for trend rate, what it is you need to know, essentially what it is, it just shows average economic growth over a specific period of time. You can even draw that graph. That's a very impressive graph to have. You don't even need to explain it. You see below the trend rate. Below shows the trend rate. You don't need to talk about it. So that's the trend rate. What you do need to know is why the trend rate might be high or low. That's what you need to know for your spec, for A-level economics. Why could that trend rate be high? Why could it be low? And here are a number of factors. Amount of education, what interest rates might be. If interest rates are expected to be low, then we know consumption is going to be high. Consumption goes up, AD goes up, GDP goes up. That's why the government thinks the trend rate is going to be high. People are going to be spending, GDP is going to go up. Okay? So there's lots of factors there. Anything else that we haven't mentioned? Technology, innovation. If firms are going to be innovative, if the government expects the firms to be very innovative, that's going to improve the trend rate in the future. They're going to produce more. they're going to be selling a lot more goods and services. Is there anything else? I think we've covered pretty much most of it. But because it's about trend rate, which is average GDP, we should be linking to components of aggregate demand. It's the easiest way to answer it. Or aggregate supply. Maybe if there are tax cuts, people are going to spend more. So the government is expecting consumption to be high in the future. That's why the trend rate is high. But remember, it could also be the opposite. Why might the government forecast a very, very weak trend rate, low trend rate? Maybe because they're not expecting people to spend because of COVID. People are worried. So the global economy. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you the actually the rest of this lesson. Spend time on this because this is a difficult aspect of the data. Also, it's a topic that you wouldn't have covered very well. So I want to make sure everyone gets it. So to summarize, trend rate similar to GDP. It's just an average over time. You need to be confident in explaining why it might be high or low. And the factors are here. You can pick it, explain it. Key is link to aggregate demand.
He said average on time.
If you can link your points to the components of aggregate demand, it makes change of reasoning. Okay? So let's get on with some change of reasoning. If you're struggling, let me know. Please feel free to also evaluate. Tell me, why it might not happen. Guys, for evaluation, I want to give you one go-to eval, okay? The rest of the world. Now, what I mean by that, the government might say the trend rate is going to be really high because this is what we're expecting. Now, if there's a massive recession out of nowhere in Germany, then people are going to be earning less money, which means they're going to go buying less from us. All of a sudden, we don't export as much, so it's damaging our economy. As an eval, you can always say you can never predict what's going to happen in another economy. And even when we're predicting our own, remember this forecast is a prediction. Uncertainties, okay, things happen, COVID just happened, financial crisis just happened, Great Depression just happened. These things happen, meaning your prediction isn't always right. So you've got 10 minutes to work on any of these, make sure you're evaluating these. And ask if you have any questions. One reason of a high trend rate or a low trend rate is because here are the reasons. Tell me why it could lead to the government expecting high GDP. So remember, try to link trend rate to GDP in mind. If we're expecting high trend rate, it means the government thinks it's going to be high GDP, high economic growth. From economic growth will be because of supply or demand. You'll be ideally better off talking about long run aggregate supply. So things like productivity, finding resources, that's why I mentioned resources, technological advances, all of those things are going to shift long run aggregate supply outwards. So that's why the government is expecting long, sort of high levels of GDP. Or vice versa. There's, firms have no confidence in the economy, there's no investment, there's lots of inefficiencies, labor is very unproductive, they're lazy, they're not working, so they're expecting a very low trend rate. So aggregate supply first before you do anything to do with AD. Not to say that AD is not valid, it is very valid as well. Because aggregate supply is going long run. Their entrepreneurial spirit, animal spirit kind of thing for investment. Good eval for that is how on earth do you measure that? The government ideally wants around 2.5% for the average economic growth. How on earth do you measure entrepreneurial spirit? And why, just because there's entrepreneurial spirit, why is there suddenly high long run growth or trend? So you should be able to eval whatever you do. The other class has a lot of pressure on eval, so if you're using one, don't know how to eval, please ask. And I'll give you a good eval on. Output that with the long-term trend. The output gap is the difference between what an economy is actually producing and the trend rate. That's the difference. So in that graph, the gap so here, you see this. This is what we're currently doing. That's what our economy is actually doing. Trend is the average of ideally where you want to be. So for example, if we're producing here, then where there's a big gap, that's an output gap, that's a negative one. So we're producing less than what we're capable of doing, or what our average is.